Hello, today I will be sharing my presentation with you all, and I have chosen to focus on top-down theories. And I'm using Screencastify to record this, so let me go ahead and hide this toolbar. Okay, so let's get started. I chose to focus on top-down theories because I find that as a high school educator, I rely heavily on the approaches connected to constructivism. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is constructivism and how does it apply to top-down approaches? According to our textbook, constructivism theory is the belief that individuals actively create meaning based on their ability to incorporate new knowledge with existing knowledge. So there's three big ideas of constructivism. The first is that learning can take place without any noticeable indicators. For teachers, this means we don't always see the learning processes our students are using while reading. Another idea that stems from constructivism is that learning is experimental and learners try to make connections within their minds. Again, this is like saying that students are like icebergs. And as teachers, we only get to see the tip of the iceberg. And we all know that underneath the iceberg is much, much bigger. Lastly, the third idea is learners use inferencing to make meaning of what they are reading. So, learning is not an occasional event to be stimulated, provoked, or reinforced. Learning is what the brain does naturally, continually. And this is a quote that I got out of our textbook from Frank Smith. And he said this in 1971. And I think this still reigns true today, that learning is something that happens naturally, but sometimes I think as teachers, we might forget that this is from the constructive standpoint. So the first theory that I wanted to focus on, and really I'm only going to focus on two for this presentation, because again, as a high school teacher, I was trying to pick the two theories that I felt best related to me and to my students, and that I could share with my fellow colleagues. So the first one I've chosen is schema theory. And I wanted to focus briefly on what it is, where it comes from, and how does it apply to teaching. So schema theory in general strives to explain how knowledge is created and used by learners. Again, it can be broken up into different parts. There's really three processes of this schema theory. The first is that learners take in new information, but they don't have to change existing schemata. This is like if someone is learning about a new plant and they already have information about plants, so nothing really has to change. They're just learning maybe a new name of a plant. And then there's tuning, which is your existing schema is altered or modified to incorporate the new information. And then lastly, there's restructuring. And that's when learners must create a new schema because the old one is no longer sufficient. Excuse me. So as a high school teacher, I would think that the process that relates most to me and my students is probably the restructuring part of this. Students already come in with a lot of existing knowledge, and not everything is new to them. And I think that one of the things that I really connected to within our textbook was that restructuring could be of a belief, so or of a change in a belief. So when I think about what my students, when they read something, maybe it's a piece of multicultural literature, and they have an idea or a stereotype in their head of a certain race or a certain culture. This is where I see my students start to let go of their old ideas and embrace new ideas, which is really kind of amazing to watch. Okay, so two people that contributed to the schema theory is Anderson and Peterson. Schema theory's biggest impact on education is showcasing the important role of background knowledge in learning. So this really stems from Anderson and Peterson. Readers acquire new information, and it is then interwoven with their existing schema, and reading then becomes an active process in which the learner constructs meaning. So schema theory has most influenced reading instruction by highlighting the central role of existing knowledge in processing new knowledge. So, bottom line for me, as far as schema theory is concerned, is how can I, as a teacher, incorporate instructional practices that focus on the ideas presented within schema theory. And schema theory really puts an emphasis on building background information. So there's a ton of different ways to build student background information. There's webbing, semantic mapping, vocabulary activities, anticipation guides, and just building background knowledge prior to reading. And there's various ways that teachers can do that as well. I wanted to pick strategies that I thought would be acceptable for any content area. For instance, one time I went to a literacy training and I sat in on a science specific literacy training. And one of the things that the science teachers kept expressing was the lexical density of their classroom instruction, the amount of vocabulary that their students had to read. So I put an example of semantic mapping, or I guess this would be more for webbing, but I think this could apply to any content area. This one that I put on here is about transportation, but this could also be a new vocabulary word for English in the middle. This could be a new vocabulary word for a science classroom in the middle. It could be an idea in mathematics. So I think this would be a good cross-curricular instructional practice that teachers could use. Then I think it's important to pay attention to the pre-reading strategies that are good for the schema building process. So I chose this. It's a little blurry, but I had to put it in here because I think this chart does a good job of showing how teachers of really any content area could use pre-reading strategies to help students build that background knowledge before they even read a word of the book. So the first one on here is beginning at the end, and that's starting at the last text page, and look at each page until you reach the back cover. Look for critical information, such as the glossary, the map, or afterward. Then the second one on here, and this is the one I really like, is the cover to cover pre-reading strategy. So I like the idea of searching for clues about characters, settings, problem, and theme of a story for my English class. But I can also see how a science teacher could pick up a supplemental reading and show the picture on the front of the book to the class, and then go page by page and let the diagrams and the bolded words and the other clues that students get presented in supplemental text like that to build that background knowledge. Again, I tried to pick meaningful technology that I thought would be useful in any content area. And there's so many ways to apply schema theory to background knowledge and to find online resources to help build that background knowledge. So one thing that I wanted to put on here was create a web online. So the mapping example that I showed on a previous slide, students can make those online, and I know that my high school students